Cannabis can be used as a kind of mild entheogen to trigger these peak experiences if it's used kind of deliberately.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. We all know that cannabis has been around for a long time, but few books go into such detail or evoke such compelling ideas about the history of cannabis as Dr. Mark Ferrera's book, Sacred Bliss, A Spiritual History of Cannabis, or his recent essay, Peak Experience and the Entheogenic Use of Cannabis in World Religions. Before our modern dichotomy between recreational and medicinal, cannabis may have been used in ancient sacred rituals in a number of the great civilizations. Dr. Ferrera argues that this plant can lead us to such peak experiences, which are a sign and a support for psychological health and self-actualization. Does this match with your experience with cannabis, or do you want to learn how to find such experiences? For me, it was such a pleasure to speak with Dr. Ferrera. He's obviously a teacher, and he's obviously an obsessively curious academic who dives deep into topics, but he does so with heart. He helps us to learn from the ancient practices around cannabis and how all those cultural clashes and spiritual inclinations are being mirrored today. The book is simply wonderful, and in this episode, I enjoyed very much learning from and being challenged by Dr. Mark Ferrera. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're very pleased to have Dr. Mark Ferrera on the show. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
And I have to say, I think your book, Sacred Bliss, A Spiritual History of Cannabis, I've read a number of books in this field, and I've never read anything as insightful in a personal way, as well as being well-researched and just being a historian. I mean, instead of just knowing something about cannabis, you obviously know world religions really well and the scope of history. And so I like how your book explained nothing about THC or politics or medical effects. You knew this would focus on spirituality with an emphasis on direct experience. And so
That's
the first question is, how did you tie that into Maslow and the hierarchy of needs?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. So Maslow wrote a book called Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences. And I found this book a few years ago. And it's a small book, but it's an important study. In that book, he's working with patients, and he's noticing a kind of pattern that his adult students and even adult patients and even adolescent patients, some of them were reporting mystical-like experiences that he had read about, in his study of mystical literature, and he was kind of struck by the similarities of some of these reports to the kind of traditional sense of the mystical experience. And so that led him, as a psychologist, to kind of approach the question of mystical consciousness from a scientific and psychological point of view. And what he does, just essentially is to integrate peak experiences into his hierarchy of needs by making peak experiences one aspect of self-actualization. So his supposition is, the self-actualized person, the person who's kind of operating on a high level and working towards reaching their full potential as a human being, is the type of person that's more likely to have these usually short flashes of unitive or mystical consciousness. And for him, they became a kind of marker of mental health. So his theory of self-actualization and peak experience are actually tied together in an intimate way. And as I was researching the article that just came out in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, I discovered that in his later life, he revisited the hierarchy of needs, and he added another category atop that pyramidic structure that your listeners are probably familiar with. And it was self-transcendence. And so that's very interesting because it's almost as if to say self-actualization isn't the final stop in the development of the healthy human being, that peak experiences or mystical consciousness is part of self-actualization. And then eventually, instead of one's outlook on the world being about oneself and about how one can reach one's own potential, you see this kind of move towards self-transcendence, where the individual becomes more interested in or less interested in the self, the ego, and the kind of thought stream, and kind of more interested in, altruistic kind of behaviors, helping others, being involved in a project that's beneficial to other people. And so there's a kind of move beyond self-actualization into this idea of egoic transcendence. And so you can see, and probably some of your listeners too, can kind of see how that would automatically fit in with our kind of understanding of mystical consciousness.
And it's part of what made your book really a good challenge, in a sense, is seeing all these levels that somebody could be reaching. On the flip side, I don't think I'm getting close to self-transcendence or anything like that. And so for us, more back closer to the mud world, Maslow was also saying how these peak experiences can be helpful for chronic anxiety and neuroses, for chronic meaninglessness, and even obsessional thoughts of suicide. So I was curious how much you've seen of that in the history and in kind of current use of cannabis.
That's a good question. So I guess part of my argument in the book and the article is that cannabis can be used as a kind of mild entheogen to trigger these peak experiences if it's used kind of deliberately, maybe in tandem with contemplative prayer or meditation, or something like that. And in terms of Maslow, he's positing that these unitive experiences provide a kind of self-validated meaning, that they have their own intrinsic meaning in them. And through that encounter with meaning, the neurotic person, for example, might be able to overcome some of those anxieties, existential trepidations, that one might carry with them through the peak experience and through the direct experience of unitive consciousness. In other words, I'm not out here alone. Actually, in the mystical experience, we recognize ourselves in the other. That Hindu expression, you are that. What you see in the world, the natural world, and so forth, and the people that we meet are not actually other. This is in an encounter with the self, right? In the mode of non-dual consciousness. And so I think he saw a real healing potential in those experiences, in the peak experiences. And there's not a lot of literature on the religious uses of cannabis from a kind of scientific point of view. But as you know, there's a lot of experiments going on with psilocybin, particularly at places like Johns Hopkins and NYU, and they're using these stronger entheogens to trigger intense mystical consciousness, sometimes visionary consciousness. And they're looking at, these peak experiences, if you will, as helping to not only deal with kind of neuroses, but things like addiction, things like end of life, folks that have terminal illnesses, um, being able to, even in the fleeting experience of the psychedelic or mystical moment, that coming back from that has a kind of uh, can have an affirming um, um, and abiding shift in consciousness where the patient can remember the experience of unitive consciousness. And a lot of reports are that these are some of the most meaningful experiences that the patients have ever had in their life. And there's kind of evidence that, after maybe taking psilocybin, 6 months later, there's still a kind of strong resonance to the experience, and that it kind of dissipates a little bit over time. And, depending on who the person is and what the situations are, somebody may want to revisit those psychedelic shores, as it were, at another time, maybe a year down the road after they've had a time to kind of process the experience. So, as I said, there's not a whole lot going on that I know about in terms of clinical trials of cannabis to trigger peak experiences. Although maybe somebody out there will get interested in that and try it. But I think we have a correlate, if you will, to the clinical trials that are going on with the stronger entheogens like psilocybin.
And that's a good point about the stronger entheogens. I like how you call cannabis a more mild entheogen. So I wanted to ask about, for people like us, like myself, I mean to say, who smoke pot, but more in a recreational kind of way, but are
Mhm.
intrigued by what you're talking about with a more spiritual approach to cannabis. What would be your recommendations from what you hear about going on in the world today, but also from what you've seen happen in history about the spiritual uses?
So I think the most important part of this is the deliberateness with which it can be used as a kind of spiritual agent or a vehicle for religious experience. And so at the beginning of Sacred Bliss, actually, I kind of target cannabis users who might be kind of more recreationally minded users to kind of draw their attention to the mild psychoactive effects of cannabis that can lead to peak experience. So I think maybe one thing that's kind of interesting about peak experiences is maybe listeners shouldn't necessarily envision some um, radically shocking alternate consciousness that would be identifiable to anybody who had one as a profound religious experience. So that's kind of an interesting point, right? That um, I know there's an expression in Zen Buddhism that don't always expect that your students know that they've had a kensho or an awakening experience. That is to say that moments of just passing fleeting moments of when the beauty of the natural world breaks through consciousness, right? So we have this kind of mental stream that's running, clicking along, this egoic consciousness that's kind of creating a sense of self. And it kind of runs quite a lot, right? And if we watch our minds, we see it operating and kind of dialogue. We dialogue with ourself, which suggests duality, right? And so, with or without cannabis, with or without entheogens, because Maslow was very clear that he thought peak experiences were naturalistic, that they occurred, across time and across culture, and that they were again natural parts of self-actualization and self-transcendence. But in some sense, the beginning student of Zen who might go to a Zendo or practice at home, some seated meditation. Um, the message seems to be that, these moments of quiet, the quiet mind, the moments when, sunlight breaks through leaves and there's a kind of, aesthetic appreciation of the beauty of the world, may be passing. It may be so passing that we kind of miss it when we're first getting going, right? And I think this relates to the recreational cannabis user. The first thing is kind of starting to recognize these short, brief flashes of what I think we would call non-dual consciousness, where the mental stream that's always kind of chugging along quiets down for just a second, and um, actually, when I was in Berkeley working on this book, I I like to write outside, and I was sitting outside, and the woman who was renting me this room came through the gateway, and she turned to this beautiful flowering bush that was right beside us, and she suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my, how beautiful that is!" And it was. There was this one bud that was just perfect in its flowering. And I thought to myself, well, that's there it is, right? Now that she had this brief flash, did she know it? Did she register it? I mean, she certainly had a sense of this is, a beautiful flower. But could she or could we rethink of it in a different kind of context as no, this is a flash, an opening, and I mean, there's a lot to say about these things, right? As Houston Smith, the great religious scholar, said, one or two or three or 10 or maybe even 100 of these insights, these kenshos, these peak experiences don't necessarily make a religious life, right? There's more to it than that. But the first stepping stone, I think, in a sense, is watching the mind, recognizing the duality of the mind, the kind of self banter that kind of goes on all the time, and then being a little more sensitive to moments when the mind is quiet and unitive consciousness can kind of emerge by itself, and usually in profoundly beautiful aesthetic perceptions. And so that might be the first thing for the recreational cannabis user is something as simple as that. Is the mild spatial and temporal shift that takes place with cannabis is very subtle, but it opens up a kind of spaciousness in consciousness. Can open up a spaciousness in consciousness that I think if we learn to kind of appreciate, and we learn to kind of identify these moments of expanded perception or alternate consciousness or unitive consciousness, that then we can cultivate them in a sense, right? That we can find ourselves more easily moving into unitive consciousness, and I think this is something that Maslow saw too. He, for him, peak experiences are usually very brief, very meaningful, but often kind of flashes. And in his book, Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences, he talks about the plateau experience, which I don't talk too much about in the book or the recent article, but it's an interesting idea that you might imagine, somebody who's had a religious and spiritual life and probably a lot of peak experiences, whether they're naturalistic or triggered by a psychedelic, kind of falling into a kind of contentment, a kind of satisfaction, a kind of non-striving, a kind of okayness with, in this particular example, old age and the kind of proximity to death. And so for him, this kind of plateau is like coming off the peakiness of the peak experience, but settling into this kind of surrender, maybe. And from that position of surrender, I think Maslow posited that one could, slip in and out of peak experiences, but fall back not all the way down to, normal consciousness, or what we would call, the egoic-driven consciousness, but can, have these peaks, but come down to a kind of higher point, this kind of higher plateau. And so it's a kind of process, I think, right? You know, uh, that we can cultivate this type of consciousness and this type of perception. And so I think the kind of thoughtful user, recreational user of cannabis, might reflect on their own lives and say, oh, okay, I kind of see what he's saying here about these flashes of insight, these moments of beauty, when I'm walking in the woods or something like that. Or Maslow talks about childbirth, natural childbirth as being a possible vehicle for peak experiences. He talks about intense sexual encounters or orgasm as a possible vehicle for this type of consciousness. So to me, it would be kind of recognize what the cannabis is doing with these subtle shifts, be a little more um, aware of what's happening in the mind and watching for those those openings. And then once we start to kind of get the hang of that, then I think we can use cannabis kind of very deliberately to, again, maybe along with our prayer or meditation or other kinds of religious, activities, to actually bring that kind of consciousness more often to the fore.
Would that be what Maslow calls being cognition? That's a term I learned from your book. So
Yeah,
you're come down from
yeah,
the peak experience to being cognition. Can you talk about what that is?
yeah. It's a good point. So it's kind of the an exceptional type of cognition that's different from everyday perception of reality. What he called decognition. And it's becoming aware of the interrelatedness of everything in the universe, including the perceiver. So we're really talking about what consciousness looks like in the unitive experience, right? That not perceiving oneself as this separate, isolated ego against others and against the world, but being cognition is a recognition of the interrelatedness of all things, this kind of nexus or web in which we're all participating. Um, and there's also in this being cognition a kind of disappearance of the viewer. That is where we get to this idea of self transcendence. Um, and maybe some of your listeners are thinking, well, once the ego disappears, what is there, right? And I think this is kind of Maslow's answer. There's this consciousness, this mode of consciousness, which is operating with an awareness of the interrelatedness of the person with the entire universe, right? And there the peak experience in a sense is a transcendent experience, so transcending the self. Um, and so in the maybe in the simplest way to put it is kind of a pure awareness, right? Without the uh, noisy interference of the normal thought stream, right? So I think Eckhart Tolle, the well-regarded spiritual teacher, has talked quite a bit about his kind of uh, conversion experience from somebody who was depressed and anxious to waking up one morning and noticing. I think very important. He says roughly that 80% of his thought pattern had stopped, right? So it's not as if we're not talking about a state of mind that's free of thought, right? Because that's not really possible or realistic. But what he does talk about is, I mean, the example that I remember is him speaking of going through a busy airport on his way to catch a flight, and that his mind can stay, he claims, very quiet and very focused during that whole experience. So if you can kind of imagine the kind of quiet mind that one could carry through such an experience, here I am. Here's what's happening. Right now I'm got my hands on my wheel and I'm driving my car towards the airport, and I get out and I get my bag and I move towards the check-in, and all of this can happen without thought, really. And I think a lot of us, maybe these thought patterns are what creates anxiety for us, right? Oh, am I going to make it? What happens when I get to the counter? Did I have my passport with me? If is there going to be anything wrong with the airplane? Who's going to be sitting beside me? And all of this kind of movement of the mind is potentially creating, separation, anxiety, frustration. And then if we kind of compare it to the Eckhart Tolle model, it's like, well, we can kind of see how the mind can function actually better, more aware, more present, as he likes to use that expression, in the here and now, and quiet. And that kind of opens up this what mystics talk about, the kind of timeless moment, the eternal now. And so I think he would say, and I think for me too, I think we might think about awakening as a process, as something, that's gradual. And I say that knowing, very well the sudden tradition in Zen Buddhism. And I don't think we need to necessarily get into a discussion of, suddenness versus gradual, awakening. But I think that it's often helpful to kind of think about awakening. Yes, here's my peak experience, and yes, here's a moment of kind of awakening. But really, I'm on a kind of spiritual journey. I'm working towards self transcendence by self forgetting. Right? It's kind of a little trickiness there, right? Because the I that wants to transcend itself, that can become somewhat problematic, right? Because we're still caught in striving. We're still trying to achieve. Where I think what Tolle is talking about is kind of a giving up or a surrender of a lot of that.
That's a wonderful idea. The airport is the true test of a guru.
Right.
That's actually a great lead into getting a little bit more into the history side of things.
Okay.
Because at CV Sciences, we love our full spectrum hemp products. But for some people with sensitive jobs or sensitive systems, they want a product with 0% THC. So we created a line of products called Happy Lane. Made with CBD from hemp grown in Kentucky, we have gummies, we have chews, we have liquids, we have soft gels, and we have the always beloved CBD roll-ons for applying to your skin. Everything is non-GMO, vegan, purity tested, and manufactured in the United States of America. So when life has you wound up, tense, agitated, antsy, uptight, jittery, or jumpy, try our Happy Lane line of CBD products. For 20% off, use the coupon code LEXFILES at pluscbd.com. Because you started your book talking about India, the civilization that has the probably longest continuous use of cannabis as a spiritual tool, which I think people know more about. But then you move on to talking about Iran and the Zoroastrians. And that might have been the initial place where humans really started to use cannabis as a spiritual tool in a widespread manner. And you suggest that possibly it was from Iran that use spread east to India and west to Egypt. And so can you talk a little bit about what we know about the early evolution of cannabis in Iran and then the rise of the first monotheism?
Sure. One of the things I was trying to do in Sacred Bliss and more recently in the journal article in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies was to make this suggestion that cannabis could be used as a mild entheogen, and then to kind of to bolster that claim, to kind of walk through early history, all the way up to kind of present day. As the book kind of ends up in the 20th 21st century, but to kind of look around the world at different cultures where we can find the use of psychoactive substances as part of religious practice. And so we have a couple problems with that. When we're dealing with the ancient world, it definitive evidence becomes very difficult to nail down sometimes, right? If we're going back thousands and thousands of years. And we have texts, like we have Vedas, the Vedic tradition in India, and with clear references to Soma, which has not been definitively identified, but which was a strong psychedelic that would be taken during certain Vedic rituals to produce powerful peak experiences. And I think we see the Indus Valley civilization as first, and then out of the Indus Valley civilization, a kind of Indo-Iranian language and culture diverging from each other around 2000 BC. And what we're positing is there's little doubt that in the Vedic tradition that psychedelics were used as part of religious practice, and that Iranian culture and language are, in a sense, coming out of that Indo tradition. And we can look at, religious texts, the Sanskrit Vedas, and the Avestan in Iran, and see similarities in terms of the content, in terms of the deities. And then we've got the linguistic side, right? That Indo-Aryan language and Indo-Aryan peoples diverged from each other. And then so the question becomes, out of that split, we have the rise of Zoroastrianism eventually, with its Avesta religious scriptures that resemble the Vedic scriptures. And then so the natural question becomes, and they had not soma ceremonies, but halma ceremonies. So they also used some, as of now, unidentified or definitively identifiable substances during religious practice to trigger, alternate states of consciousness. So the question really becomes, how does cannabis fit in here? And so it's tricky because there's really no kind of scholarly agreement about this. I think the connection I would make is there's a good chance that Soma, the Vedic psychedelic, if you will, may have included what we would call magic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms, maybe ephedra, and possibly cannabis, right? And so this, not quite sure what the ingredients are, but we're very sure that there are references to cannabis in the Vedas, and as Hinduism developed out of the Vedic tradition, we find a pretty clear place for cannabis in Indian culture, and so it would make sense that that place would also be found for cannabis in the Iranian tradition. Um, but this stuff can't be really nailed down, and the farther back we go, the more difficult it becomes to kind of be very definitive about, for example, the Zoroastrian use of cannabis, particularly. If it was being used, which seems to me quite probable, it was probably part of the Halma decoction.
And perhaps for a time a little bit closer, once the Persians and the Arabs started mixing together, where at that point I believe both religions were kind of frowning on cannabis, but the mystics of each tradition were embracing cannabis, the shamans of Persia and the Sufis of Islam. It sounded like something that could be applicable to today, when you have different cultures meet around mysticism or being out there or being kind of freaks and frowned on by the establishment. So what happened then, and do you think it shed some light on what's happening today?
And when you say what's happening today, what in what way?
In the
What
pushback. It just seems like it's such a time of cultural foment and all of these different religions, I guess since the 60s or so, all of these religions and practices and ideas mixing together, and there being a heavy pushback against them, but somehow that only makes them stronger. And it seemed like that might be a repetition of what happened when the Muslims and the Persians met, and their mystics embraced each other, but their religious leaders did not.
Yeah, good point. Mystics, I think, always have a way of recognizing each other across tradition and across culture. Maybe one of the most accessible examples is when Buddhism comes to China, and it mixes with the native Taoist traditions. The Taoists were very quick to kind of recognize some of the central ideas in Buddhism they could match with their own indigenous Taoism. And so, I mean, I just offer that as a kind of example of the way that mystical consciousness really, I think mystics have a way of recognizing each other. And I guess there's something about mystical consciousness that can break down the kind of barriers that normally separate people, separate religions, cultures, and traditions by finding common ground. And in the cases that you're citing, and I think it's a good example to the countercultural revolution of the 1960s that you mentioned. That in the 1960s we have this embrace of psychedelics, including the milder psychedelic cannabis, and you see this embrace of it, and then you see this around the 1980s, maybe a little bit earlier, you start to see this start a rejection, making psychedelics inaccessible to people by making them illegal, essentially. And, that might be a correlate to kind of, Orthodox Islam compared to Sufism, right? Where, the mystical consciousness is being cultivated in a lot of different ways that aren't necessarily accepted by orthodoxy. For example, music and dancing, and of course, the consumption of cannabis not only as a psychoactive agent that can transform consciousness, but as a medicine, right? That mendicants would use in their ascetic lives. And in the if we wanted to just draw that correlation out a little bit to the 1960s, we could say that in the 1980s, Reaganism, Reagan Thatcherism, you start to get this real pushback. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and so I remember the the anti-drug ads that were on TV. The one that still sticks in my mind, and probably some of your listeners too, is the frying pan that was heated up on the stove, and it's starting to smoke, and somebody cracks an egg and it starts to fry, and this is your brain, and this is your brain on drugs. And a lot of clinical trials with psychedelics were shut down. And now I think, 20 years later, 30 years later, things have really shifted in some positive ways, right? Not only are psychedelics getting a new look with double-blind clinical trials. Michael Pollan's new book is out, and he talks about his own experiments with psychedelics. And cannabis is just amazing what's happened with cannabis. Starting with I think it was California who legalized medical marijuana first. I wish I could give you a date right off the top of my head.
96.
And it's just okay, thank you. And has just, marijuana medicine is spread especially widely, but we're starting to see, legalization and decriminalization. And so one reason I wanted to write Sacred Bliss was it felt like, wow, with this new sea change, this new embrace of, chemicals as a way to transform consciousness in positive ways. This is a great time to kind of say, for people who are lucky enough to live in places where cannabis is legal to you as a medicine or recreationally, isn't this a good time to kind of contemplate a more profound engagement with this ancient plant that's been with us and part of our lives for thousands of years through many cultures. So I'm kind of heartened by that, especially having grown up in the 80s.
That's a stirring challenge for all of us, that we're in this lucky spot to try to take things to the next level. And it actually speaks to the next question I wanted to ask, because you talk in your book about some of the famous mystery rites in human culture, the Eleusinian rites, the Dionysian rites, the Mithric mysteries, where we often don't know what psychoactives were being consumed, but we know that they were important. Going there once or twice in your life was such an important part of this. Yeah. And so I wanted to know if you would have any advice for perhaps a group out there who wanted to have their own version of mysteries. What do we know about the mysteries that were happening, how involved they were, what kind of things were being done? And if there was a modern underground church or religion around this, how would you think, what advice would you give if you were a cultural advisor, someone trying to set up a new version of the mysteries using maybe a mix of cannabis and psilocybin?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So yeah, the mystery religions are, cults in the Greco-Roman world that provided members and sometimes through ceremonies, the larger public an opportunity for religious experience. And you make a good point that a lot of these were societies that had initiation rites, right? That you would become part of it and move through a couple stages. So one would be a kind of commitment to a religious tradition of some sort with an emphasis on altering consciousness, right? That is to say that unitive consciousness can be kind of distinguished from ordinary consciousness. And what we're interested in these mystery religions is through common meals, dances, ceremonies, initiation rites, that we try to induce peak experiences, religious experiences that are transformative, not they're fleeting, of course, but something about them lingers in consciousness and becomes transformative, or becomes the base of self transformation over time. And there were many different types of these mysteries, and in some of them, as you point out, there were the ingestion of some type of um, psychedelic, and again, it's difficult to know, and so there's always a lot of conjecture about what these substances were. But I think the idea of coming together with a kind of seriousness, um, a kind of deliberateness to the way that a ceremony would unfold over time and work towards, the peak moment, or the peak consciousness. Um, the responsible use of these psychedelics, I mean, I think in the mystery traditions, these were sacred substances, and so they were revered, and they weren't to be taken for fun at a party. They were used in this kind of serious religious context. Um, and there were performative elements too, where people are acting together, and you're watching myth being reenacted and unfolded. Um, and so, I think we I feel like I need to say we need to be mindful of, what the law allows us to do with some of these substances, and some of the Native American use of peyote, for example. There are, peyote churches, some of your listeners may be aware of. And so these are operating within, the law, and they're able to offer people who are interested a kind of experience that is guided, that is serious, that is respectful of the psychedelic, preferably um, a organization that is led by a, a person or a group of people who have familiarity with the psychedelic landscape, if you will, and can guide um, people through that experience. And when I read about, for example, the psilocybin trials at Johns Hopkins, that's one of the things that strikes me right away too, is um, the the fact that a clinician, a doctor, would be there with somebody that people are prepared, um, often, over a pretty good period, actually, to be prepared for taking the psilocybin. And then once they're there, once they start their trip, there's somebody there to guide somebody through the anxiety that might come as a trip turns bad, for example. And so I think it's a difficult question in a lot of ways about what contemporarily could work for people, but I feel compelled to kind of say that whatever it is that's going to work, it has to be, I think, serious, and grounded in religious experience. And I know that phrase is, I mean, we're talking about in our conversation peak experiences. So in that case, we have a kind of outline of what that experience looks like, right? Religious experience comes in lots of different, lots of different kinds, and so we're talking about a particularly transformative type of peak, or unitive, or mystical consciousness. And so whatever group or what, as people experiment with these substances as triggers for um, self-actualization and eventually self-transcendence, to use Maslow's model, that the members of the community and the traditions need to be, kind of firmly grounded in that, right? That's really what we're trying to do here. And for Maslow, maybe it's important to reiterate again, for him, peak experiences were not only accessible through the use of chemicals or psychedelic substances, but these are naturally occurring um, shifts in consciousness that any healthful, psychologically healthful person has access to. And as I was trying to say, as we were speaking earlier, sometimes I feel like people may not even be aware at first, that this was a kind of Kensho moment, a kind of opening moment. So I think, to have members of, whatever group are um, working with peak experiences to be kind of, well grounded in what those are. Um, does that get at what you were, what you
Yeah,
were, what you were interested in?
I am curious. I'm sure this stuff is happening around the country in some places, and if
Uh,
so, if anyone hearing this is doing that kind of stuff, reach out to me and we can interview you anonymously. That would be great.
excellent.
Um, and so the last two questions I actually wanted to ask about were about books, because you're a researcher. You have the bibliography for your book was really impressive, and in your book you chronicled some of the most important modern books we read about cannabis, especially Rabelais, Gargantua and Pantagruelian, but also the
Sure.
writers from the Club de Hashishin in Paris and Fitzhugh
Yeah.
Ludlow in the States, modernists like Yeats and Ginsberg and Joan Didion and Don DeLillo. I was wondering, were there any surprise favorites you found in your literary list that you hadn't known about before you started researching this cannabis book?
Yeah, I think I used literature in the Western world in Sacred Bliss, the final chapter before the conclusion, to talk about or trace cannabis use in Europe. So my book kind of wanders around the world and kind of ends up back in Europe. And so I thought I'd use literature to kind of look at um, Western, European, and American history from about the Renaissance to the present day. So as I was researching the book, I started looking for, I guess what we might even call a genre of cannabis literature. And I think I, touched on some of the important texts that we might associate with marijuana literature. But it's not really a comprehensive accounting. I was moving my way through time, across the centuries towards the modern world. And so I was kind of picking and choosing texts that made sense for that, historical presentation. But I think there's other books out there, other than the ones that I cover in Sacred Bliss, that your readers may be familiar with, like King Suckerman, or the Wonder Boys, or Savage Detectives, that one could easily put in this genre. T.C. Boyle, I mentioned in my book, but um, his book Buddy and Prospects would certainly fit in there. So I think there's other text out there that we could use to kind of create a I mean, maybe it's a good idea for a book for somebody that's out there listening, that maybe a sustained study of, where can we find references to cannabis, hidden or overt, in the literary traditions of the West. I mean, I think it's probably a project that's still out there for somebody to kind of tackle and find a way to unify that survey of marijuana literature, whether it's thematically or, culturally, chronologically, find a way to kind of do that. So yeah, I feel like I just kind of opened up a path, hopefully, for readers to continue their exploration of places that we find references to cannabis in literature.
And one I could mention for listeners is Mike Jay is a researcher who collects a lot of cannabis literature together. But there's like you said, there's still a lot more to go. The last thing I wanted to ask about was when I first started asking you to be on this show, you said that you had to review this because you've written 3 other books since this
Yes.
one, and this
Yes.
book hasn't been out that long. So I was curious what else you've been working on in the meantime.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So yeah, I've been writing quite a lot recently, and I'd be happy to chat just a bit about that. So when I finished Sacred Bliss, I started work on a book called New Seeds of Profit because I was interested in American business. So a very different kind of subject. I tend to do this. I tend to get interested in a topic and want to research it, and then I kind of write the book as a way to kind of synthesize what I learned in my journey and to kind of share it with other people. And so in that book, I was kind of looking at the heroes and villains of American business. Right, these are the main two myths that we have about American business. Right, is that American business and entrepreneurs made America. Right, that's one of these kind of heroic. We kind of make them heroes. And then we've got this other narrative that we tell ourselves about business that no, business people can't be trusted. They're self-interested. They're just interested in profit. They don't care about, the environment. They don't care about their workers. And, I kind of walk through, history, American business history, to do that. And there is a kind of connection to Sacred Bliss there. The 3rd chapter of that book is about a religious critique of greed as problematic in business. And then the last part of the book takes a look at the late 20th century and early 21st century, and it kind of outlines egregious practices of American capitalism, right? The worst abuses, the environmental destruction, the lack of access to medical care, the 1099 movement, et cetera, all the kind of ills that we associate with, income inequality that is characteristic of modern American capitalism. And the last chapter, the book's called New Seeds of Profit, and some listeners may, recognize Thomas Merton's book, New Seeds of Contemplation. So I was kind of riffing on that. And it posits, a type of American capitalism that can emerge and that is emerging, that is more mindful of including all stakeholders, that is mindful of the environment, that is interested in the health of the workforce. In fact, I used Maslow had a book called Maslow on Management, where he went into a business in California and as a consultant and kind of observed how things were working. And this does connect to our conversation that we've been having today, that Maslow believed that businesses should offer work that's self-actualizing. Right. And so the second part of the last part of that book posits a kind of new type of capitalism that can, still be interested in profit, but isn't solely driven by the profit motive, and is, more in touch with, kind of ecological concerns, the concerns of income inequality, worker health, et cetera, et cetera. And the newest book is called American Community: Radical Experiments in Intentional Living. And also, this book is looking at 400 years of intentional community building in the United States. And so it starts in the colonial period in the first chapter, and really kind of focused on, European immigrants who came to the United States and created intentional communities where they shared resources for the benefit of the whole group. And then I follow that trajectory of intentional community building, before the Civil War, and then another chapter on after the Civil War. And then I pick up in the 1960s when we had thousands of counterculture communes being created in the United States, with many different, kind of foci. And yeah, so I wanted to show that, maybe contrary to some thinking, the United States has a long tradition of community building around what we might regard as almost socialist kind of ideas of finding a way to live together with a kind of common purpose, and to share our resources together. So, there was lots of variations in how people did this. Some communities allowed private property, some insisted on, everything being, communal. Some of these communities had businesses that they ran, as ways to generate revenue, and then you had other groups who, um, found other ways to kind of subsist, whether it was donations from other individuals. I'm thinking of transcendentalists, for example. And then I guess I'll just briefly mention I've finished a new book and it's out for review now, so I'm hoping that we'll find a publisher for it soon. And it's something quite different, although it's still connected to spirituality. It's about my own experience of living with anaphylactic food allergies, deadly food allergies. And so I kind of do some memoir where I kind of talk about the 4 or 5 times I've almost died as a result of eating small amounts of tree nuts. And then I talk about things like, how to, raising children with severe food allergies, how to negotiate school bullying, how does an adult with a food allergy kind of handle, things like job interviews in restaurants that could be dangerous to them. And then it kind of ends up, the last chapter is really about if you're living with an illness like this, or, other, maybe more severe illnesses in the sense of maybe terminal cancer or something, that ultimately we have to kind of learn to surrender to the possibility that our next meal could be the one that kills us, right? The most severe form of food allergy, in the most severe form of food allergy, an individual can die within 30 minutes to an hour after ingesting a trace amount of an allergen. And so I use that as a kind of way to say, well, this can be positive, right? Because this living on the edge of the here and now is what can imbue our life with meaning, right? And so I kind of end with a kind of spiritual focus on that. And just finally, that one's done, and I'm trying to, like I said, I'm looking for a publisher for it, and I've started a new book on the Erie Canal. I'm interested in the voices of the past along the Erie Canal, the ghosts of the Erie Canal, the women, the slaves, the Irish immigrants, the packet boat operators, the children who worked the towpath. And so I've started to visit sites along the Erie Canal here in New York. And next summer, I hope to take a boat up the whole 363 miles. And that's my new project. So that's where I am. So it's a lot of energy. And, I would say, yeah.
You really grab a topic and run with it, huh?
I do. It's a strange way to kind of make an academic life. The more traditional way is to pick a topic and kind of stay with it, and to become the expert on that. But my mind just kind of works in a different way, and I really like to get in there and do the research and learn. And the books are a kind of natural product of that kind of curiosity, and hopefully they're useful to other people. I think that's, that was my real hope with Sacred Bliss, was that, this is helpful to people. And if it's helpful to people, I'm just terrifically glad to have the opportunity to do it.
It is helpful for people. To anyone listening, I've read a lot about this subject. I've never read anything quite like Sacred Bliss, both in terms of learning about subjects, but also learning about something that's going to help me personally. So your curiosity certainly helped me, and I'd recommend it to anyone out there listening for it to help them. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on today and sharing from your knowledge and taking the time to talk with us.
Lex, it was a real pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show today.
All right. And when it's time for the talk about the next book, we'll have you on again.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com or on YouTube or on all the podcast platforms. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code LEXFILES for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com or follow the podcast on Twitter at The Lex Files Show. If you enjoyed this program, please rate us on iTunes or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. And our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. Remember the coupon code LEXFILES. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off. Signing off. Signing off. Signing off. Signing off.